You have to find your reason for being, and you have to find your reason for existence.
I remember the first time my son told me he was getting married. His voice trembled with excitement, and for a moment my tired heart felt light again. After years of working in silence, cleaning other people's homes, mending other people's clothes, and swallowing my pride so he could stand tall, I thought, finally, life was giving something back. He said she was perfect, beautiful, educated, from a good family. I smiled and nodded, pretending not to notice the way he avoided meeting my eyes when he said it. Even then, something inside me whispered that I was about to lose him to a world that had never welcomed me, the dump. First time I met her family was at a dinner they arranged, a grand house with glass walls and furniture so expensive you were afraid to breathe near it. I had worn my best dress, a faded blue one I had kept for years, the one I wore to church when my husband still pretended to love me. As I entered their home, her mother's eyes scanned me from head to toe, pausing too long at my worn shoes. Her father smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that warmed a room. It was sharp, evaluating. Selena, my soon-to-be daughter-in-law, introduced me softly. "This is Mama. She's simple, but kind." The way she said simple felt like a knife. They spoke about expensive vacations, about wine, about investments, words I'd heard but never used. I stayed quiet, stirring the tea I wasn't sure I should drink, pretending not to hear her mother whisper, "She looks like a maid who got lost on her way out." My son laughed politely. He didn't defend me. That silence burned more than any insult could. But I didn't flinch. I smiled, lowered my gaze, and let them believe what they wanted. Sometimes you learn more when people underestimate you. What they didn't know was that I was far from the helpless woman they imagined. Behind my quietness was a past none of them could have survived. The fortune my husband left after abandoning us was hidden, untouchable, under my name. The business they thought had collapsed was still breathing quietly through a foundation I controlled from the shadows. But in that room, I played my part perfectly, the naive mother who didn't belong. I wanted to see just how cruel they could be when they thought I was powerless. A week later, Selena came to visit me. She said she wanted me to understand their world, that I should let her parents handle the wedding arrangements. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes carried arrogance she couldn't hide. I looked at her manicured hands clutching her expensive purse and asked softly, "My son will still call me mother, won't he?" She smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Mama." "If you behave." I should have stopped her then. But I didn't. I wanted to see how far they would go. When the wedding invitations were finally printed, my name wasn't among the guests. My neighbors received theirs, every one of them, while I waited by the door, pretending I hadn't noticed. My son called once, said he was busy, said he'd come visit soon. He never did. On the morning of the wedding, I put on my old gray shawl, the one my husband once called the cloth of poverty, and walked to that hotel anyway. I told myself I would just watch from afar, but when I reached the hall, the guards looked at me with suspicion. "You don't belong here," one said. I looked past him, saw my son in his golden sherwani, his arm wrapped around Selena, smiling like he had everything he ever wanted. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. Then her father spotted me. His expression twisted into disgust as he walked toward me. "Who let this woman in?" he barked. The guests turned to look. I stood still, frozen under 100 eyes. My son's face turned pale, but he didn't move. Her father came closer, his voice low but full of venom. "We don't need beggars at this table." A silence fell over the hall so thick it felt like the air had stopped moving. My heart clenched, not from his words, but from my son's silence. He didn't say a word, not one. I turned and walked out slowly, every step heavier than the last, the sound of laughter echoing behind me. But as I crossed the gate, I smiled to myself for the first time in months. Because in that moment of humiliation, I finally saw them for who they were, and I knew something they didn't. They thought they had won. They thought they had married into power, but what they didn't know was that the real power was standing right in front of them, dressed in a gray shawl. And as I walked away from that glittering hall, I whispered to myself, "The game has just begun." I stopped attending weddings after that night. For weeks, I couldn't even walk past a bridal store without feeling the sting of that man's voice echoing in my head. We don't need beggars at this table. I would wake up at dawn, sit by my window and watch the city move without me. My phone stayed silent. My son didn't call, not once. The world had turned its back quietly, and I let it. Because sometimes silence is where you learn who you truly are. The days blurred into each other until one morning, a letter arrived. It was an invitation, not to another wedding or party, but to join a charity foundation in the city. I recognized the name immediately. It belonged to my late husband's old business partner, the only man who knew the truth about what really happened before my husband disappeared. People thought I was destitute, surviving on pity, but the truth was very different. That foundation, the one feeding hundreds of families, was mine. Registered under another name, built from the ashes of betrayal and shame my husband left me in. I had kept it hidden for years, building it quietly, funneling everything I had into helping women who had been cast aside like I once was. And now, sitting in that office again after so many years, I felt something inside me come alive. The smell of fresh paper, the weight of a ledger in my hand, the sound of people calling me auntie with respect. It reminded me that I was not powerless. I'd simply chosen to be quiet. But what happened next made that silence heavier than ever. Selena, my son's wife, came to see me one afternoon. She looked radiant, wearing designer clothes that sparkled under the sun, her perfume filling the small office as if it didn't belong there. "Mama," she said sweetly, "I want to learn about charity work. I want to help the poor." Her tone was soft, but her eyes were measuring. I knew immediately this wasn't about kindness. It was about control. She wanted to see what I was doing, how I lived, who I spoke to. I smiled and welcomed her. I even poured her tea in a chipped cup, the same one she had once mocked. She looked around the small room, trying to hide her surprise. "It's so humble," she said, placing her handbag carefully on her lap, as if the chair might stain it. I told her stories about the women we helped. Widows, single mothers, young girls with no one left to turn to. She nodded politely, but her attention wandered. Then she said something that made my stomach turn. "You know, Mama, it's good that people like you find ways to stay useful. Not everyone is meant for higher circles." I smiled. "Yes," I said softly, "not everyone can handle the weight of real work." But that night I couldn't sleep. Her words crawled under my skin. I thought of my son, sitting beside her, believing every polished lie that dripped from her lips. What would you do if your own child started treating you like a stranger in your own home? Would you scream? Would you beg? Or would you stay quiet long enough to see who he becomes without your shadow protecting him? Days turned into weeks, and Selena kept visiting, always alone, always with that same rehearsed smile. She asked questions about the foundation, about the donors, about the finances. I gave her half answers. Let her think I was harmless. But every visit revealed something new about her. The way she dismissed my helpers. The way she rolled her eyes at the stories of struggle. The way she said these people like they were beneath her. She was not helping the poor. She was studying them like trophies for her own pride. One evening, she stayed later than usual. The sun had dipped, and the office lights cast her in a soft glow. She leaned back in her chair and said, "Mama, can I be honest with you?" I nodded. "You'll never understand our world. Some families are born to serve others. It's just how life is. And maybe that's why my husband loves me, because I remind him of where he truly belongs." I froze. For a moment, I didn't even breathe. My son, the boy I carried through storms, the child I fed with my own hunger, belonged to her world now. She said it so casually, like stating the weather. My heart cracked, but I didn't let it show. I only looked at her and said, "You're right, Selena. I don't understand your world." She smiled, satisfied, not realizing that in that moment, she had revealed her entire game. After she left, I sat there for hours, staring at the donation files spread across my desk. Something didn't feel right. The foundation's funds were balanced, but a few transfers looked unusual. Small amounts missing, moved to different accounts. My heart began to race. I pulled out the old folders, records I hadn't checked in months. That's when I found it. A single receipt, tucked between papers that didn't belong together. A payment made from my son's account to Selena's father. The date matched the week after their wedding. My hands trembled as I held it. My mind replayed every humiliation, every polite insult, every, "Mama, you wouldn't understand." And suddenly it all connected. The missing invitation, the cold smiles, the strange way Selena's father had looked at me that day. They hadn't just wanted to keep me out of the wedding. They had wanted to keep me away from something much bigger. But what was it? Why would my son's money go to her father? Was it a debt, a deal, or something darker? I folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into my bag. The foundation's lights flickered off behind me as I stepped outside, the night air heavy with questions. Somewhere in the city, my son was sleeping beside a woman who had just opened the door to something I could no longer ignore. And for the first time since that wedding, I didn't feel humiliated. I felt awake, because that one small receipt, that careless line of ink, was the first crack in their perfect smile. And I promised myself that night I would find out what else they were hiding. I told myself I was done crying for that house. That's how it all began. With a lie I whispered to my own reflection. But deep down I knew I wasn't done. I wasn't just grieving a home or a son. I was grieving the woman I used to be. The one who believed love could protect you from greed. Because in my family, love had become a weapon. The first sign came in the form of a letter from the bank. A cold white envelope resting on my doorstep. I almost didn't open it, but something in my gut told me I had to. Inside was a notice, a transfer of ownership on a property I'd helped my son purchase years ago. It was in Selena's father's name now. My son's signature sat neatly beside it, trembling slightly at the edges. I knew that tremble. It was the same one he had as a little boy, holding a pen for the first time. Except this time, he wasn't signing homework. He was signing away his life. I remember calling him that evening. My voice was calm, almost detached. "Son, did you sell the property in Clifton?" There was a pause, a silence so thick I could hear his heartbeat through the phone. Then he said softly, "Mama, it was for business." Just that. Business. He had started using words that didn't belong to him. Words from Selena's world. But what happened next left me speechless. 2 nights later, I was invited to dinner at their new house. It wasn't really an invitation. It was an obligation. Selena had texted me, "Father insists you join us. He wants to clear misunderstandings." I knew what that meant, a performance. When I arrived, the table was already set, silver cutlery gleaming under chandelier light. Selena's father greeted me with that same hollow politeness that rich men reserve for the people they intend to crush. All through dinner, I stayed quiet, smiling when I had to, nodding when spoken to. But then, just as dessert arrived, I heard something, faint, almost drowned under laughter. Selena's voice. She leaned close to her father and whispered, "He's falling faster than we thought." Her father chuckled. "Good. Once the merger is complete, we'll be done with him." And her too. Her too. I froze. Every muscle in my body tensed, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I reached for my glass and took a slow sip, pretending to admire the taste. Inside, my stomach churned with fire. They weren't just using my son. They were planning to erase me from existence, financially, legally, emotionally. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my small home in the dark, touching the walls as if they could speak back to me. Every crack, every faded paint line held a memory of struggle, of love, of sacrifice. I whispered to myself, "They think I'm weak because I don't scream." But silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. The next morning, I started my quiet investigation. I began by visiting the bank again. I told the manager I was just an old mother checking her son's safety. He smiled, too kindly, and excused himself to fetch some papers. What he didn't know was that I already had copies of most of them. What I needed was his confirmation. And I got it. My son's joint account had been drained. Millions transferred systematically into Selena's father's business trust. The signatures were all legitimate. Every move was legal, and yet so deeply wrong. When I left that office, the world outside looked different. The air felt thinner. The city I'd built my life in suddenly seemed foreign. I wasn't angry anymore, not yet. I was something colder, focused. Days turned into weeks, and I began collecting what they didn't want anyone to find. Bank statements, loan documents, emails. Each paper was a blade, and I was gathering them for a war I hadn't chosen. But the night that broke me was the night I saw the will. It happened by accident. My son had fallen asleep in his study, exhausted, restless. The drawer to his desk was half open, and something inside caught the light. A folder, old, familiar. I pulled it out slowly, my hands trembling. It was my late husband's family will, the same one we had updated together years ago, ensuring our son and I were protected. But now, as I opened it, my name was gone, erased. In its place was a new beneficiary, Selena. My knees almost gave out. I sat on the floor, holding that paper like it was poison. My son had signed it. Not because he hated me, but because he trusted the wrong woman. I wanted to wake him, to shake him, to scream, "Look at what they've done to you." But I didn't. Because I knew if I did, he'd defend her. Love makes fools of even the smartest hearts. So instead, I placed the folder back and walked to the mirror across the room. My reflection stared back. Tired eyes, a faint scar by my temple, hair graying at the edges. For a long time, I didn't recognize her. The woman who once fought the world to raise her child had become a ghost in her own story. But that night, something changed. I whispered to my reflection. They think I've lost everything. But they've forgotten. I built this house once before. I can build it again. And as I turned away, I caught my son murmuring in his sleep, Selena's name slipping from his lips like a prayer. I smiled, but it wasn't a smile of love anymore. It was the kind of smile you wear when you finally see the battlefield clearly. Because from that night onward, I stopped being the mother who begged for love, and became the woman who kept receipts. And when I opened his drawer one last time, and saw that old family will, with my name erased, I knew they weren't just ready to steal my son. They were ready to erase me completely. I used to believe silence was my shield, but that night, silence became my weapon. After discovering the will, the betrayal carved in ink, something inside me hardened. For years I had begged for peace, but peace was never what they wanted. They wanted control. They wanted my name erased, my story rewritten. My son turned into a puppet whose strings they pulled with soft hands and sharper tongues. So I stopped asking for peace and began planning for justice. The first step was quiet. I went to see my lawyer, an old friend who once helped me hide everything when my husband's debts threatened to swallow us whole. He looked at me over his glasses and said softly, "You're smiling again." That scares me. I told him I was ready to make some changes, permanent ones. I rewrote my will, every line deliberate, every word a blade disguised as kindness. All my assets were moved into an anonymous trust. No names, no traces, just a shadow account that only I could access. It wasn't about the money, it was about power. I was taking back the one thing they never thought I had, control. Then came the dinner. It was Selena's father who unknowingly set the trap for himself. He wanted to thank the mysterious donor who had pledged a large sum to their charity foundation, the very foundation that ironically had been mine all along. I accepted the invitation, but I wasn't coming as the poor, quiet mother they once dismissed. I came as the woman behind the curtain. That evening, I stood before the mirror, fastening an emerald silk dress I hadn't worn in years. My late husband used to say that green made my eyes look like secrets. I smiled at the thought. Maybe that's what I wanted to be tonight. A secret that finally spoke. I wore gold earrings, simple but heavy, the kind that whispered wealth without screaming it. And when I walked into that restaurant, the room fell quiet for half a second. The kind of silence that tells you everyone is trying to guess who you are. Selena's parents didn't recognize me at first. Her mother's lips parted, searching for familiarity, but my posture, my tone, the calm in my voice, all of it was foreign to them. I sat down gracefully, introduced myself as Mrs. Lena, the donor. They smiled too wide, their greed disguised as gratitude. "You have no idea," Selena's father said, "how much this foundation means to us." I just smiled back and replied, "Oh, I think I do." As dinner unfolded, I let them talk. They spoke of legacy, of family, of charity, words soaked in hypocrisy. Every sentence they spoke was a confession they didn't even know they were giving. And then, halfway through the meal, I leaned forward and said softly, "You don't remember me, do you?" Selena's mother blinked. Her father frowned. I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the table. "Perhaps this will help." I opened it, one by one, pulling out copies of bank statements, transfer slips, property papers. All signed, all dated, all showing their theft of my son's accounts, their faces drained of color like someone had pulled the blood right out of them. Selena's mother whispered, "Where did you get these?" I smiled. "From the same place you took them from. The family you thought was beneath you." The silence that followed was the kind that vibrates. Heavy. Electric. Then Selena's father tried to recover, his voice shaking under his arrogance. "You have no proof these are real." I leaned back, folded my arms, and said, "You'll find out soon enough. I made sure the board of your foundation receives the originals tomorrow morning." And that's when she appeared, Selena herself. Late, as usual, but dressed like she owned the room. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "Mama?" she whispered, disbelief dripping from her lips. I looked at her, calm, unreadable. "You call me Mama now? Interesting. You never did when I was serving tea at your table." She started crying. Crocodile tears. Perfectly timed. "I did it for him, Mama. I did it for love." Her voice cracked on love, but it sounded rehearsed, hollow. I turned to her father, who suddenly looked small in his expensive suit. "You taught her well," I said. "Manipulation disguised as emotion." Selena stepped closer, hand on her stomach, trembling. "I'm pregnant," she said, tears spilling freely now. "You wouldn't hurt your grandchild, would you?" For a second, my heart stopped. A flicker of pain, confusion, hope, all tangled together. But then I remembered her voice, that night before the wedding. I had recorded it without meaning to. My phone had captured every cruel word. I reached into my purse and pressed play. Her voice filled the room. "Once we get the accounts merged, he'll be easier to control." "His mother? Don't worry. She's nothing. She doesn't even matter." The sound echoed like thunder. Selena's face went pale. Her mother looked away. Her father tried to stand, but his hands were shaking too much. I turned off the recording and said, "That's what you thought of me. That I was nothing. But you forgot. Nothing is exactly where power hides." For the first time, none of them spoke. Even the waiters avoided our table. The air was thick with shame and fear. I stood up slowly, gathering my papers. "You wanted my son's future. You wanted my silence. Now you'll have neither." But just when I thought the night was over, a shadow fell across the table. 2 police officers walked in, crisp uniforms and unreadable faces. One of them asked, "Mrs. Lena?" I nodded, confused but calm. He handed me a document, an arrest warrant. And then his words sliced through the room like glass. "We have an arrest order. For your son." I froze. Selena gasped, or pretended to. Her father's mouth twitched into something between guilt and satisfaction. And as the officers turned toward the door, I realized this wasn't the end of the game. This was only the beginning of the reckoning, because now, even I didn't know whose side my son was truly on. They said I was bitter. They said I was vindictive. But they never said I was wrong. The first time I stepped into that courtroom, I felt the weight of every year I'd spent being underestimated. The marble floor was cold beneath my feet, and the air felt like it had been holding its breath for too long. My son sat on one side of the room, head bowed, shoulders trembling. Across from him, Selena and her father whispered to their lawyer, smug in their false confidence. I should have been shaking, but I wasn't. I'd been preparing for this moment since the day they humiliated me at that wedding. This wasn't just a trial about money. It was a trial about blood and name. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder, and for a moment, I thought of all the times I'd prayed for justice in silence. Now it was here, wearing robes instead of mercy. My son's lawyer began with calm words. "Your Honor, my client is a victim of fraud committed by his in-laws." But Selena's lawyer interrupted sharply, painting me as a controlling mother with a personal vendetta. He said I manipulated documents, that I was obsessed with revenge. His words cut deep. Not because they were true, but because I could see my son believing them. He couldn't even meet my eyes. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and shout, "I raised you alone!" Every breath you took came from my sacrifices. But I stayed silent. Justice doesn't come to those who scream. It comes to those who wait their turn. When they finally called me to the stand, I could feel the tension tighten around the room like an invisible rope. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't. I looked at the faces before me, the same people who once laughed behind my back, and I began to speak. Not like a witness, but like a mother. I told the court everything. How I had worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs to raise my son after his father abandoned us. How I watched him fall in love with a woman who smiled with poison behind her teeth. How I discovered that the foundation in Selena's family name was actually mine, stolen through deceit. Every word came out measured, calm, deliberate. I didn't need anger to prove my truth. I had evidence. I placed the bank records on the table, one by one. Each document was like a nail in their coffin. The lawyer for Selena's family tried to object, claiming they were fabricated. But then I revealed the audit trail, digital, time-stamped, verified by my own accountant. Even the judge leaned forward. Still, Selena wasn't done playing innocent. She stood up dramatically, tears already glistening, her voice soft as silk. "Your Honor," she said, "this woman has always hated me. She's jealous. She couldn't stand that her son finally found happiness." I laughed. Not loudly, but bitterly, like someone laughing at her own funeral. "Happiness?" I asked. "You call ruin happiness? You call theft love?" But the real turning point came when the judge ordered the playback of the recording. The one I had played during dinner, now entered officially as evidence. Her voice filled the courtroom once more. "Once we get his name on the accounts, she'll be gone. That old woman has no idea what's coming." The sound of her own words destroyed her mask. Her lawyer buried his face in his hands. Even her father looked away. My son, who had sat in silence the entire time, finally looked at me, eyes wide, trembling, as if the fog had finally lifted. Then came the moment I'll never forget. The judge leaned forward and asked a single question. "Mrs. Selena, who owns the charity foundation?" The room went still. No one even breathed. Selena hesitated, eyes darting between her lawyer and her father. I don't know," she stammered. The judge's tone sharpened. "Answer the question, Mrs. Selena." Her lips trembled. "It's under my father's name," she began, but I interrupted calm and clear. "Incorrect, Your Honor. The foundation is registered under the name Eleanor Grace Holdings. That's me." "Always has been," the courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled, gasps rippled through the benches, and Selena's father went pale. The judge slammed his gavel for silence, but the damage was done. The truth had landed like a hammer on glass. Selena broke down, crying uncontrollably. "I didn't mean to," she sobbed. Her father tried to take the blame, claiming he'd done it all for business reasons. But the judge had heard enough. Their empire of deceit was collapsing in real time. I looked at my son again. He had tears in his eyes, not of shame anymore, but of realization. He whispered, "I'm sorry, Mama." I nodded. There were no words left between us that could rewrite the years of betrayal, but maybe, just maybe, there was a beginning to healing. When the verdict was announced, it wasn't just a legal win. It was something deeper. Selena and her father were found guilty of fraud, misappropriation, and defamation. My son was cleared of all charges, but I didn't smile. Justice isn't sweet. It's quiet, heavy, and humbling. As the gavel fell for the final time, I stood there in the silence that followed, not triumphant, but free. For the first time in years, I wasn't someone's mother, or someone's victim, or someone's fool. I was myself again, and in that silence, when even the judge couldn't speak, I realized I had won more than a case. I had won back my dignity. He came back in the rain. No cameras, no lawyers, no pretense. Just my son, standing at the gate like a child who'd finally come home after being lost too long. I didn't rush to open the door. I just watched him through the window for a moment, wondering how many storms he'd had to walk through before this one. When I finally stepped outside, he looked at me, eyes swollen, voice trembling, and said the words I'd been waiting years to hear. "You were right, Mama." I didn't know whether to hug him or to cry. But I did neither. Instead, I said, "No, son, you were just late." It wasn't anger anymore that lived inside me. It was something quieter, heavier. Forgiveness doesn't come with applause. It comes with silence, with the kind of peace that hurts before it heals. He told me everything that had happened after the trial. How Selena's family went bankrupt, how their investors pulled out, how their house was auctioned. The empire they'd built on manipulation had crumbled the same way it was made, through deceit. He said Selena had tried to reach him, but he didn't answer. He had nothing left to give her, not even pity. And for the first time, I saw the man I'd raised. Not the boy who needed approval, but the man who understood the cost of dignity. But even as he spoke, I could feel something in me resisting comfort. I wasn't celebrating their downfall. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted redemption, not for them, but for me. For the woman who once begged to be seen as enough. For the mother who had been mocked for her simplicity, humiliated for her kindness, and still chose not to harden her heart. So I started over. Quietly, without grand speeches or press releases. I reopened the foundation, the one they stole from me, but this time it bore my name. The name they had tried to erase, Eleanor Grace. I didn't rename it for revenge. I did it because the women who came to me, single mothers, widows, daughters abandoned by promises, they deserve to know that Grace can be reborn from ashes. Every morning I'd open the office and see their faces, tired but determined. And I'd think, this is what real wealth looks like. Not numbers in an account, not property deeds or rings on a finger, but people, helping people. Still, there were nights when I couldn't sleep. Nights when I'd walk past the house where my son used to live with Selena. The curtains were gone, the gate rusted, the garden dead. Yet standing there, I could still hear the echoes of laughter that wasn't real. The dinners where every compliment came with calculation. The way they used my boy's love as currency. And I realized something that stopped me cold. The entire story had begun with one small thing. A dress. A simple blue dress they mocked at that engagement party. That was the moment they measured my worth by fabric, and I let them. That was the moment I decided to act poor, just to see who would love me when they thought I had nothing. And when they showed me their true faces, I knew what I had to do, because sometimes you have to shrink yourself, not to stay small, but to see who tries to crush you when you do. People often ask me, "How did you forgive your son after everything?" And I tell them, forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about refusing to let it poison what's left. I didn't free him because he deserved it. I freed him because I was tired of carrying pain that wasn't mine anymore. And you know something strange? The more I gave away through that foundation, food, education, hope, the richer I became. Not in money, but in meaning. Every widow who smiled, every child who held a new book, every mother who said, "Thank you for believing in us." It rebuilt something inside me that betrayal had shattered. One day, my son came to help at the center. I watched him sweep the floors, serve food, talk to the children. No designer suit, no expensive watch, just humility. When a little boy tugged at his sleeve and asked, "Are you Miss Eleanor's son?" he smiled and said softly, "I'm her student." And I turned away so he wouldn't see me cry, because in that moment, I knew I hadn't just won a trial or rebuilt a name. I had raised a man again, from the ruins of pride. Sometimes I walk alone through the garden behind the foundation. There's a bench under a jacaranda tree, the same kind that used to grow outside our old home. I sit there and watch the petals fall, like tiny reminders that beauty doesn't last forever, but grace can grow again. And when I close my eyes, I can still hear my younger self saying, "One day, they'll know who I really am." Now I don't need them to know. I just need to keep living in a way that honors the truth, my truth. So if you're listening to this, ask yourself one thing. Have you ever pretended to be less, just to see who truly valued you? Because sometimes the only way to know who's real is to lose everything that isn't. The day my son called me mother again, without shame in his voice, I understood the final lesson. The truth doesn't destroy families, secrets do.